thank the Red River Valley League for inviting me to come over and host this forum with them tonight. A little bit about League before we get started. We are a 100-year-old organization. We're nonprofit and nonpartisan, focused on grassroots voter education. We encourage active and informed participation in government and influence public policy through education and advocacy. The League does not endorse candidates or political parties. The views expressed tonight are those of the candidates and not of the League of Women Voters. Membership in League is open to all, men, women, students. We welcome everyone. To learn more, you can visit the Red River Valley League or lwvmn.org. This virtual forum is being recorded and will be available online beginning tomorrow. Our format for this evening is this. The candidates will all have 1.5 minutes for an opening statement, and they'll have 1 minute at the close. With the questions, they will have also have 1 minute to respond. The order that the candidates will respond varies with each question so that each candidate has an opportunity to be first and last. And I'll try to give you an alert before coming to you. Our timer tonight is Whitney Oxendahl, a member of the Red River Valley League. Thank you, Whitney. Out of consideration for other candidates and those who will be viewing this video, we ask candidates to please respect the time limits. Candidates, if you would please mute yourself until it's your turn to speak to reduce any background noise. With that, let me introduce our candidates for tonight. Senate District 4, we have candidate Kent Eakin. His opponent, Mark Larson, did not respond to multiple invitations. State Representative District 4A, we have Heather Keeler. Also State Representative District 4A, Edwin Hahn. State Representative District 4B, Brian Anderson. And House District 4B, Paul Marquardt. We're going to begin with opening statements, beginning with Kent Eakin, who will be followed by Heather Keeler. Good evening, Kent.
Good evening, Terry. Thanks so much for hosting the event tonight. This is and thanks to the League of Women Voters for the wonderful work that you're doing in informing the public about the candidates and our positions on the issues. I guess I just want to say a little bit about why I run. First of all, I am in my second term in the Senate. Prior to that, I had served in the House. My wife, Lori, and I have raised our 4 children on a 4th-generation family farm where I grew up. So it's my great grandparents that started that farm. We live in the house that they built. And the reason that my family got involved in politics, it was really my father who got directly involved in electoral politics. And it was because he found out that he had a son who was intellectually disabled. It wasn't immediately apparent, but when they discovered that, they were told they had one of 2 options. One was to send him away from home, where he'd be living 100 miles away from home in an institution where he'd get some training. The other was to keep him at home, but he would receive no formal education. And that inspired my parents to get involved in a movement to start a special education program for children with intellectual disabilities in our area. It's when we really came to understand how important politics is to the daily lives of everyday average people in our area. And that inspired me to want to get involved in politics as well. And my brother and my father are no longer here, but that special ed program that my brother helped to inspire and that my dad helped to start is still going. And I'd like to do something like that myself, to leave something behind that's going to have a positive impact on people's lives.
Thank you, Kent Eakin. Next, we'll hear from Heather Keeler, who will be followed by Edwin Hahn. Go ahead, Heather.
Hi, my name is Heather Keeler. I moved to Moorhead in 2013 because of education. Like many of us, that was the thing that got me here. And this community, I just absolutely fell in love with. I moved here and I earned my bachelor's at MSUM in project management. and my master's in educational leadership. I've worked in areas of education and healthcare and community involvement. I've really been a voice for the underserved populations. And that's one of the main reasons why I decided to step up and run and be a voice for our community. I serve as the vice chair of our Human Rights Commission here in town. I also sit on the Native American Commission. I've been volunteering in this community ever since I moved here. I've sat in living rooms with our families for many years to hear what some of the barriers are to areas of education, healthcare, and different areas when it comes to inclusion. I really believe that it's important to have inclusive decision-making when it comes to both local, state, and other levels. And so I'm just really excited to be here. I did go through the endorsement process and the primary, and so I've been meeting with our families and our community members for months. I do not door knock because the health of our community is a priority to me, but I have been doing phone calls and many other sorts of outreach. So again, I thank you, League of Women Voters, for putting this on.
Thank you very much, Heather. Next, we'll hear from Edwin Hahn, who will be followed by Brian Anderson. Good evening, Edwin.
Thank you, Terry. And I so much appreciate the mission of the League of Women Voters, because I believe that the change really comes from grassroots efforts and what happens right here in our communities. So that means how we treat our neighbors, what we teach our families and our children. That's where the true change comes for beneficial movement in our communities, not from elected officials. So I'll start off by saying that I'm for the people, not the party. And what does that mean? That means I believe this role as a public servant role, and that the people in our community as well as the state are sick and tired of political theater and the divisiveness in this country. So I'm looking to bring us back together as a community, as a state, and hopefully a nation. And what does that mean? Just it means just doing what's best for Moorhead. So being a champion for Moorhead, going down to St. Paul, pulling our tax dollars out of Metro, getting them back up here so we can finish our roads and our bridges and our underpass and revitalize our downtown and invest in our youth. So innovative educational opportunities, as well as bridging the gap when it comes to our small businesses. So I'm proposing a reciprocity between Fargo and Moorhead businesses to have streamlined regulation, taxation, and permitting. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Edwin Hahn. Next, we'll hear from Brian Anderson, who will be followed by Paul Marquardt. Brian, good evening. Brian, I believe you're still on mute. If you would unmute yourself, please.
All this technology. Good evening, and thank you for having me on tonight. My name is Brian Anderson. I am from Detroit Lakes. I am an avid outdoorsman, which is one of the reasons I like this part of the great state of Minnesota. We have done a great job in this area, connecting our many small towns while still keeping nature right outside our doorsteps. When I am out meeting new people in these small towns across our district, you find all the reasons that make our part of the state unique. It's the people. I see people helping their neighbors, talking to one another, and kids playing football in the backyard. This type of openness and friendliness allows people to support each other, and these values are what I want to represent in St. Paul.
Okay. Thank you, Brian Anderson. Paul Marquardt, hello.
Well, good evening, and thank you to the Red River League of Women Voters and Terry for moderating, and everyone who's going to watch tonight or watch in the future, and all the candidates who are here tonight. I want to say what an honor and privilege it's been to serve the residents of Fort B for a number of years. It is very enjoyable to represent you folks down in St. Paul. Also, I've been a teacher at Dilworth, Glidden, Belton for 37 years. Thoroughly enjoy that. I'm married to my wife, Colleen, for 39 years. We have 2 children, Lindsay, who's married to Grant, and they have 2 children, Addison and Lincoln. And I have another daughter, Ashley, who's married to Andrew, and they've just had a new baby girl, Hadlin. So if you're counting, that's 3 grandchildren, yeah, which are a lot of fun. I have lived in this area my whole life, and I know the people, I know the values, and I know when people sit around the kitchen table and folks that I've talked to, they're really concerned about COVID-19 and how that's impacted them as far as, you know, jobs and security. the education for their children, a distance versus hybrid learning. I just talked last week to a business owner, small business owner, who didn't know if they were going to be able to continue and make it through much longer. I also know when I talk with folks, are very concerned about making sure our communities are safe and making sure that law enforcement is fully funded and supported. That's huge. They're looking at affordable property taxes, looking to make sure we take care of our veterans and we have accessible and low cost, affordable health care. So I'm looking forward to discussing the issues tonight. It's the people that matter, and that's what we're here for tonight. And thank you again for hosting.
Thank you, Paul. Paul, if you'll keep your microphone open, I'm coming to you with this first question, and you will be followed by Edwin. The question is this, and I'll repeat it. What do you see as the greatest challenge facing Minnesota right now? How would you use your position to address that challenge? I'll repeat. What do you see as the greatest challenge facing Minnesota right now? And how would you use your position to address that challenge? Paul Marquardt?
It's definitely the COVID-19 pandemic. I mean, besides people dealing with their health and a lot of people who have known loved ones who have passed away, but it's not just the physical health, but also the economic health we have to deal with, and making sure that people who have lost jobs and businesses that are on the brink of going out of business, we need to step in as a state and make sure that people who may not find another job get the proper training. We have to make sure businesses have the funding to be able to bridge these tough times as we work through the COVID-19. It's led to a big budget deficit. We know we're going to have to deal with that. I think it's going to be very important that as we look ahead, we continue to look at regionalizing an approach. So when we deal and build up our capacities and we're looking at protecting people and businesses and our way of life, that we also take a regional approach. A one size fits all when we deal with COVID-19 simply does not work.
Thank you, Paul Marquardt. Next, we'll hear from Brian Anderson, who will be followed by Heather Keeler. Brian.
I thought Edwin was next.
Oh, I apologize. Edwin, you're second. And then you, Brian. Go ahead, Edwin.
So the question is, what is the
Greatest challenge facing Minnesota right now, and how would you use your position to address that challenge?
Well, of course, COVID-19 is in front of everybody's faces, but I believe that there's a even greater challenge that Minnesota faces, and that's the division, the unrest, the fear, and threat of public safety. And so for the most part, I believe that division is the biggest threat and the biggest challenge that not only our community, our state, but our nation faces. And so if we are united and we're strong, we'll be able to take on any challenge, even COVID-19. And so because we are weak right now, we are divided, we're not unified in an approach and a strategy, that's the biggest challenge. As far as how we address that, again, it's having these conversations, it's representing the people and pulling together all the voices in these conversations and moving forward together as a unified front instead of a political theater.
Thank you. That was Edwin Hahn. Next, we'll hear from Brian Anderson, followed by Heather.
Hi. I think the greatest challenge in our state right now is the coronavirus pandemic that we're dealing with. I think a lot of it is the overreach on the half of the government, basically telling that our regions how to handle it and how we should deal with it, when that doesn't apply necessarily in our rural areas, our rural communities. Some of these policies that we're being held to are definitely holding our small businesses back. And that's a big reason why these small businesses are going under is because they can't do what they need to do to make the money that they need to survive. I think we need to reach out to those businesses and get them back up and running. You know, we're not the metro area. We don't have the people as close to each other as we do up here. And I think we can handle it a lot better regionally than we can statewide.
Thank you, Brian Anderson. Heather Keeler.
Yeah, I think COVID is a huge challenge, but I think it's the impact that COVID has had on our communities. It's impacted our education system. Kids are either virtual learning, things change. I know in our community, our high school just went home for a couple weeks and then they'll go back. Housing, it's affected. We have people who are losing their houses because they can't go to work because job situations have changed, and our small businesses and community is suffering because of that. And so I think COVID is the main thing, but there's different levels to that. And so to me, I just think we need to really focus on the inclusiveness of it so that we're not making decisions that only prioritize our populations that are what we like to identify as privileged. We make the statement that everybody can go home and learn from a distance or work from a distance. I think that's a privileged statement because not everybody has those capabilities. And so I think we need to really build the bridge to make sure that the transition is equitable for everybody and that people can stay in their houses and we have quality healthcare for everybody to access during this time.
Thank you, Heather. Kent Egan, what do you see as the greatest challenge?
Well, I think I would agree with others who have said COVID-19 is the greatest immediate challenge that we're facing in our state that we need to grapple with. And I agree with Representative Marquardt that it needs to be done in a regional approach to ensure that we're taking into consideration the unique challenges and situations that we face in rural Minnesota. And that applies to other issues as well. We need to always be considering the different situations and circumstances in different areas of the state. But a longer term challenge that I think doesn't get the attention that it needs and deserves is that of long-term care for seniors and people with disabilities. I think that that's absolutely critical to acknowledge the demographic changes that we're facing, the likes of which we haven't seen in world history as far as the percentage of people that are now entering their senior years and will be in need of that long-term care. And with people living longer, we need to ensure that we're providing good quality care for those who need it, the most vulnerable citizens. And I've actually introduced a constitutional amendment that would create a dedicated fund specifically for that purpose.
Thank you. That was Kent Egan. Kent, if you'll keep your microphone open, this next question is coming to you first. And Paul, you will follow Kent on this one. Let's talk more about the COVID pandemic. What policy changes do you recommend be enacted by the legislature to better prepare Minnesota for the next economic and public health crisis? What policy changes do you recommend be enacted by the legislature to better prepare Minnesota for the next economic and public health crisis? Kent Egan.
And I think that's an excellent question because we need to be looking down the road. This isn't going to be the last time that we experience a challenge like this. And we do need to be prepared. And we see the importance of being prepared in what happened during this last pandemic now. We need to make sure that we do have personal protection equipment necessary to address any crisis that comes at us in the future. We need to make sure that we have enough ICU beds or beds that can be transitioned into ICU beds for any kind of pandemic challenge like this in the future. We need to make sure that we have also a surplus or a rainy day fund in order to withstand and cushion the blow of any economic impact that this is going to have for businesses and for communities that are experiencing hardship as a result of that. We need to make sure we have the capacity for testing. We need to make sure we have all of these things in place, ventilators and things of that nature. So if we ever experience a pandemic like this again, we are adequately prepared to handle it.
Thank you, Kent. Paul Marquardt.
I think we've learned a lot this time from COVID-19, and I'll echo much of what Senator Egan said. First of all, we have to make sure we have the built-up capacities for our ICU beds, personal protection equipment, ventilators, testing, masks, all of those type of things. Good thing going in this time is we had a budget reserve, the largest we've ever had in the state at $2.4 billion. We always need to keep a reserve in place to deal with this type of emergency. I think it's also important, and something I do different than what's happened overall, is we have to take a regional approach. A one-size-fits-all does not work. We have to look at various regions and look at the data, because every area, like rural Minnesota, is going to be a little different than the metro area. Also, folks that don't have a job or businesses that are losing business, they still have to pay property taxes. I think we have to look at really lowering property taxes in times of these type of emergencies where they have the fixed costs but are still paying property taxes. We have to have a tax system a little more nimble in the future.
Thank you, Paul. Heather, you're next, followed by Edwin. Go ahead, Heather.
Sure. I'll go back to kind of what I mentioned before with creating an opportunity for access to quality healthcare for everybody. We did learn a lot. The one thing we didn't learn is what the long-term effects are of COVID. We can assume that it's going to affect us, but we really don't know. And so making sure that we look at that single payer insurance option, because I do think that it gives us the bargaining tools to have access to medications at a reasonable rate for everybody. But also I'll follow up what Representative Morcourt said that, yeah, I think that property taxes is important because people need to stay in their homes. But I think we also need to recognize that, especially here in 4A, we have a large rental property. A lot of our people rent, and we need to make sure that we can keep them in their facilities and their homes as well. And so looking at rental or eviction freezes to make sure that we can keep roofs over people's heads. And then also making sure that we have the PPE for our frontline workers, because I know that nurses pay for that out of their pocket at times.
Thank you, Heather. Next, we'll hear from Edwin Hahn. Edwin.
So absolutely, everything that was mentioned with preparedness and PPE and hospital beds to address a future coronavirus is all true. But I'm going to say that definitely the thing we should be focusing on is economic prosperity and freedom. Because without prosperity, we don't have the resources to build out more hospital capacity. We don't have the resources to purchase or manufacture PPE. We don't have the resources to be able to pay for all of this healthcare. So we definitely need more economic freedom in the state of Minnesota. We have residents and businesses that are fleeing, they're exiting the state of Minnesota to other states with far more economic prosperity and freedom. So if we offer more freedom economically, it lifts everyone up and it provides a healthier, safer Minnesota.
Thank you, Edwin. Brian Anderson.
I think a lot of it comes down to just making sure we had all the right PPE and the ICUs ready for everybody. I think that was about the only downfall that we really had in this state. I think a lot of us were ready for this. As long as people, keep your distance and wash your hands, a lot of it's kind of takes care of itself. A lot of it's like an average flu season. The infection rates and the death rates are a lot like an average flu season. So the things that people have been doing in the past are the things that we've all should be doing right now. The things as far as statewide that I think should be different is I do think we do need to take a regional approach. I think every region should be allowed to make our decisions based on what's going on in our region. If something's different going on in southern Minnesota, they should have a different choice than the ones made up in our region.
Thank you, Brian. If you'll keep your microphone open. You'll answer this next question first, followed by Heather. We're going to stay with the topic of the pandemic. The global pandemic has brought healthcare access into the spotlight for many families in Minnesota. What do you envision as the best path forward to ensure Minnesotans are able to access quality healthcare? I'll repeat it. Healthcare access is now in the spotlight for many families. What do you see as the best path forward to ensure Minnesotans are able to access quality healthcare? Brian and then Heather.
I'm definitely not an expert when it comes to healthcare. I don't know all the intricacies to how the whole healthcare system works. But what I would say is trying to keep it affordable so that people can afford to get the healthcare. That's the biggest part of it. Allow some options for people that are not as economically stable so that they are able to supplement, so that the state could supplement their healthcare costs so that they can still get on the program. I think a lot of businesses do a pretty good job of getting healthcare for their employees. So most people that are employed should have decent healthcare. I have seen the cost of my healthcare has gone up substantially in the last 10 years. And I think there's definitely some ways that we should be able to get those costs lower for people so that they can continue to stay on their healthcare plans that they're on.
Okay, thank you, Brian. Heather. You're next, followed by Paul.
We need to move to the single payer option. Everybody has to have the same access to healthcare. When I talk to business owners, especially our small business owners, healthcare is a cost that is really huge for them to provide for their employees. And when we're talking about supporting our businesses in areas that we can provide a little bit of relief, I think that if we move to that option, we help our business owners, and then we also help our entire community. We know right now that people don't go in and get the help that they need, especially in preventative care. This is much bigger than just COVID. And what we look at and what we know is that 23% of our general fund goes to help cover the healthcare expenses, because what we do know is that when people get sick and they don't have insurance, they don't just go in for doctor's appointments, they end up in our emergency rooms, and those are the most expensive visits. And then the state helps cover those costs. And so I think when we do that, it helps reduce the cost, but also we know that when we join forces and we have one larger bargaining system, our medications can be reduced, similar to the system like the VA uses.
Thank you, Heather. Next, we will hear from Kent Egan, followed by Edwin.
Yeah, and I would say that I've supported the expansion of Minnesota Care, which is a very popular, effective insurance program that is for working people who can't afford the full cost of insurance. So it's done on a sliding fee scale. They pay based on their ability to pay. And it caps out at a certain income level. But I've supported legislation that would remove that income level so that people could buy into it. They would pay the full cost of it, but it would be a lower cost option that would be made available to the general public. And so I think that we should be doing something like that. It would add one more option that people could choose from. It would inject more competition into the system, which is good because competition results in better quality services at a lower price. I would also say that we should focus on prevention. And Heather had mentioned, getting out in front, I guess, of health issues before they become real major problems, and preventing health problems before they become crisis situations, and also addressing the drug price issue. And I run out of time, but that's another major issue we need to address.
Thank you. Next, we'll hear from Edwin.
Well, I'm definitely a supporter of a strong healthcare system and continuing accessibility and affordability of healthcare for our residents. I think we can do that through several different innovative mechanisms, but working with our local suppliers like 3M, like Medtronic, and any pharmaceuticals to lower the costs of medical devices and prescription medication. So just continue to work in that area in the short term, but I do believe in the long term that healthcare does need some major reform. And it needs to come from education and understanding of wellness and a comprehensive whole body approach. And so that I believe that we can be doing things within the education system for our youth, as well as adults, to teach about how to really take care, feed, nurture your body for whole body wellness.
Thank you. Edwin, you'll be first on this next question.
So Terry,
Yes.
I think you forgot me on this round.
Oh, Paul, you know that's not my intent. I apologize.
No, I understand that.
No.
I just better want to be fair here, so.
Absolutely. You've got a minute, Paul.
Okay,
Every
thank
second
you.
of it.
Well, I think one way in which you can lower healthcare costs is lowering drug costs. And I was proud to support a bill this year that created a lot of transparency in how drug companies set their pricing, hopefully driving down costs. I also supported a bill this year that's going to provide affordable insulin for people who need it. We've had, believe it or not, we've had people in this state who have died because they've had to ration their insulin because they couldn't afford it. That bill that we passed this year now will require at least a 30-day supply for $35 and guarantee a 90-day supply for $50. I mean, insulin prices have tripled in the last 10 years. And this will go a long ways in helping all the people that need insulin on a daily basis. And finally, I think that Minnesota Care option, people paying their premiums, but being able to get in on that, small business owners and farmers, would be a good option to look at.
Thank you, Paul. Again, my apologies. Edwin, you'll go first on this question. We are going to change the subject to that of education. Edwin, do you see a way to change school funding at the state level so school districts are fully funded and not dependent on local operating levies? And let me repeat that for you. You'll go first, followed by Brian. Do you see a way to change school funding at the state level so school districts are fully funded and not dependent on local operating levies? Go ahead, Edwin.
Well, absolutely. And also knowing that education is 41% of our state budget. Definitely, I believe that we can be innovative in education. And so what does that mean? That means looking at alternatives when it comes to where our parents want to place their kids in the private sector, whether that's homeschooling or whether that's private schools as well. And so incentivizing parents to have more alternatives, more option when it comes to where they want their children to go to school. And in that way, it will reduce the overall teacher to student ratio, or improve that, as well as reduce the burden on our school systems.
Okay, thank you, Edwin. Next, we'll hear from Brian, and Kent, you will follow Brian. Go ahead, Brian.
I think some ways to get some funding assistance for the schools in the local district would be to get some businesses involved. They're the ones that benefit from the education of the students. So if we get some of the private businesses in the areas to invest in some of these schools and get some of the technical departments, some of the computer and the science departments, they would get better employees in the end. It would benefit them. It would benefit the schools, and we could get some better technological programs going on in these schools. We have RDO as a big company in our area, and I'm sure they could definitely use some great workers to work on their equipment, to work on the equipment in the fields, to the welders, the mechanics. If they had some programs in some of these schools, they would get some really good assistance out of it. I mean, they'd get good employees, and we would get good education from them.
Okay, thank you, Brian. Next, we'll hear from Kent Eakin, who will be followed by Paul Marquardt. Go ahead, Kent.
Thanks, Terry. And yeah, I would definitely support shifting more of the burden of funding education to the state level, because when we push it on to the local units and the local school districts, we oftentimes see have and have not school districts and schools emerging throughout the state. Certain areas not having as good a quality education as others if they're in a more property poor area, which includes a lot of rural communities across the state. So I think that we need to make sure that we at the state level step forward and provide the funding necessary to ensure that no matter where you live, whether it's in a remote, sparsely populated area of the state, like Northwest Minnesota, or if you're in the metropolitan area, and no matter what the financial background of your family is, and no matter anything else, everybody gets the opportunity to develop to their fullest potential. And I think, we had something called the Minnesota Miracle in Minnesota that was implemented for that very purpose. And we need to continue to bolster that Minnesota Miracle.
Thank you, Kent. Paul Marquardt, and Heather, you will follow Paul.
Our schools are crucial to our community, especially our small communities, not just with the education, but with the economics, and brings a lot of energy to the community. So we have to make sure we provide them. And every time we rely more on property taxes rather than the state to pay, it hurts rural Minnesota, because it just forces up property taxes on lower tax-based communities. And that's why I was proud to work with Kent Eakin on a bill in my tax bill last year that was the agricultural school bond credit that really helped farmers. Now on any of the debt service school building bonds, agricultural land will get a 70% credit. That comes from the state. There's a great example of money coming from the metro and helping rural Minnesota, and we fought for that and got that. And not only is that going to help solve a very unfair property tax problem for farmers, but it helps get equity out here to rural Minnesota.
Thank you, Paul. Heather, go ahead, please.
Education is a foundation that we have to continue to invest in. We used to invest in it more. It was something that was a priority, and we ended up in a $54 million deficit when it came to education. And like many have mentioned, that there are certain populations then that just don't have the opportunity to afford education. And education really needs to be an opportunity for everybody, not a privilege for some. Because that's how we all grow. And you're right. Once we do that, then it reinvests in our own communities, and we grow because of that. I think that we need to implement the tuition freeze so that at a higher education level, we're not looking at our students to make up that deficit. We really need to be responsible for that on a state level. And also, I agree. I think collaboration with our communities is a priority. I think places like Moorhead are doing that really well as we add our tech center here, and we're going to really focus on partnerships and apprenticeships to get our labor workers ready to work in our community, especially bringing bigger projects into our community so our students can work right alongside that, and making sure that our employers are investing in education and providing those opportunities as well.
Thank you. Heather, you're first on this next question, and Paul, you will follow Heather. This also is on the topic of education. The question is long. I'll repeat it twice. Dozens of Minnesota schools have been repeatedly cited by the Minnesota Department of Human Rights for bias against students of color. Minnesota also has the largest achievement gap between white students and students of color. As a state legislator, what policies will you work toward to address these educational disparities? Please be specific. Again, disparity between and bias between students of color and white students, and the largest achievement gap between the two. What policies will you work toward to address educational disparities? Heather, you're first, followed by Paul.
Thank you for the question, Terry. This is actually one of the things that I'm really passionate about. I used to work in the school district as a Native American liaison, and I saw this happen to my students. It happened to me very much as I grew up in education. So a couple of things that I would want to address right away and that I've been talking about is the implementation of cultural inclusion in our curriculum. We have to start talking about the differences in our culture from a very early age, but bigger than that, representation matters when it comes to our teachers and our staff. In our community right now, our teaching staff is 96% white, and our minority population in our school district is nearly 40%. So when students aren't seeing teachers who look like them and represent them, there creates a disconnection when it comes to education. But also there's implicit bias that takes place with that. When we have a population that's teaching a minority students, we tend to have an implicit bias that plays a role in how we discipline them and the different ways that we view our populations. And so we need to address those. And so I would really do the cultural inclusion, but then also work on the grant program to get an increase in minority teachers within our school districts.
Thank you, Heather. We'll go next to Paul Marquardt, and he will be followed by Edwin. Go ahead, Paul.
The achievement gap is the largest problem we have right now in education. And back a few years ago when I chaired the Education Finance Committee, we had a gentleman from the Minneapolis Federal Reserve Board come in and talk to us. And he said, if you could close the achievement gap and improve work productivity, it would increase our GDP, our gross domestic product, by 2 to 5%, which would be $5 to $10 billion of increased economic activity every year. So it is very important that we make sure we provide the opportunities for every single student to achieve. And I think the way you start is we did kindergarten, all day, every day kindergarten a few years ago. That has been wonderful. I think we have to start earlier with pre-K and make sure we get kids early, because we got to get everyone to the starting line at the same time or they never catch up. That's what folks are telling us. So invest early in our children.
Thank you, Paul. We'll hear now from Edwin, followed by Brian. Go ahead, Edwin.
Well, I certainly believe this issue is, and the pun is intended, it is more than skin deep. So it's not about skin color or minority status, but this is definitely a cultural and a belief system that is a generational change that was going to take some time to improve and advance upon. So when it comes to these issues, there's some innovative solutions to build and teach our not only our youth, which that's where it's going to come from. The generational change will come from the next generation to be able to address these racial disparities, not from the existing teachers in the classroom today. So I'm proposing a pilot program which uses music and a collaborative setting and experience to teach our youth how to interact with each other, regardless of what color their skin is or what their family background is. I'll just interject too that there needs to be some responsibility put on our parents and how they are involved in the education of their children.
Thank you, Edwin. Next, we'll hear from Brian, and Kent will follow him. Go ahead, Brian.
Edwin was just touching on what I was going to include into mine. A lot of it comes down to the parents and how they push a lot of their kids in their education. Some just don't take an attention for what their kids have going on at school. So I think some of it could come back to, helping the parents to understand what the kids need to be learning in school. There definitely is some, exclusions going on at school with some kids excluding others. And there definitely needs to be some changes to get that stuff included in our curriculum and in our education so that these kids are learning how diverse our state is and how diverse our communities can be. I do a lot of door knocking and I meet a lot of people, and there's definitely some diversity in our communities. There's a lot of people out there that have varying backgrounds. And I think our kids need to see that and see that we are all different people.
Okay, Brian, thank you. Go ahead, please. Kent.
Yes, thanks, Terry. I would agree with much of what's already been said in regard to as far as having the teaching staff, those that are teaching, reflect the population. And I think that we need to do more in recruitment as far as recruiting people from underrepresented communities. I also think that teacher training would be very important in recognizing and addressing the implicit bias that's been talked about. I think that as far as addressing things early on, I think that's critically important too. Our Representative Marquardt mentioned the pre-K. I think even going earlier than that, we actually need to be looking at prenatal care all the way from the very beginning. I remember somebody coming into my office talking about fetal alcohol syndrome and saying how a child who's been, handicapped by that, we're going to be paying for the rest of that child's life if we don't do something to prevent it from happening. So things of that nature need to be addressed. And we all benefit when everybody is given that opportunity to develop to their fullest potential. And I think we need all hands on deck right now, and we can't afford to let anyone fall through the cracks.
Thank you, Kent. You'll be first on this next question, followed by Heather. We're going to stay on a similar topic. What kinds of policies, if any, will you pursue to promote social and racial justice statewide? What kinds of policies, if any, will you pursue to promote social and racial justice statewide? Go ahead, Kent.
Well, and I think we've already been addressing that with the issue of education, ensuring that everybody in the state, regardless, I mentioned regardless of where they live, but regardless of their their race, regardless of their ethnicity, regardless of their gender, they deserve a chance to develop to their fullest potential. I think that's truly the key to opportunity. And if we want to bill ourselves in the state of Minnesota as a true land of opportunity for everyone, we need to make sure that we're adequately investing in education to ensure that everybody has that opportunity. From the very beginning to the very end of their educational careers or their educational years, they need to have that opportunity. We need to make sure that we're keeping tuition down to a level that's affordable for everybody in the state. Because I think that, well, education generally is really the engine to success and opportunity and economic development and a good quality of life. And it's one of the reasons we enjoy a high quality of life is because we have invested a lot in that. I think we've been falling behind in that regard, and we need to do more.
Thank you, Kent. Heather, we'll hear from you next, followed by Edwin. Go ahead, Heather.
Harry, can you repeat the question for me, please?
Certainly. What kinds of policies, if any, will you pursue to promote social and racial justice statewide?
Well, it's one of the things that we've talked about on the human rights level for a really long time, both locally, state, and nationally, is that we have to talk about the accountability when it comes to our different structures. We've been seeing racial discrimination for forever, ever since our country was built on racial discrimination. And so we need to be really honest about that. We need to look at the disparities. It happens in education, it happens in healthcare and housing. We look at it in our incarceration system and our foster care systems. And so in order for us to create any change or any policy, the first step is that we have to be honest and open and talk about it and do it in a space that we recognize that change needs to be made and people need to be held accountable. We have to have discrimination acts in place. I know that this year, we passed something that seems very simple to some, but it's very impactful for other as far as discrimination against hair. It was something that was happening to a lot of our minority populations. So we just need to continue to have those types of conversations and be really honest when we talk about them at the table.
Thank you, Heather. Next, we'll hear from Edwin, followed by Brian. Go ahead, sir.
So my wife runs a program called Musical Bridges. It's designed to create spaces for all voices. So in these spaces, students learn to listen, take turns, and be a voice in a music setting. Now these skills are then applied to other school, work, and play groups. And through music and interactive learning, children become more aware, compassionate, and united. So I support the advancement of this kind of program into some type of policy or variations of it because it edifies Minnesotans and Americans of all backgrounds rather than excluding or overlooking some.
Okay, thank you. Next, we'll hear from Brian. Go ahead, please.
I don't know what policies you could put into place to promote social and racial injustices. I think for the most part, our communities in Minnesota do a pretty good job of already promoting, people's diversities. I think a lot of us get along pretty well with one another, regardless of where you're from or, what your background is. I think a lot of that comes from, some family backgrounds and, maybe there's some ways we could get some families to understand that, diversity is beneficial to the communities. The great things that people bring to our culture from other places in the world are the things that some of us appreciate the most. Pizza, spaghetti, those things come from different cultures, we wouldn't have a lot of that stuff if people didn't come and intermingle with us. And, we appreciate it. I think everybody in these communities does.
Okay, thank you, Brian. Paul, go ahead. Go ahead,
Yeah, I
please.
think you really addressed that issue by providing equal education and economic opportunities. And we've talked about education. Education's a great equalizer, and that's why we have to make sure we fund that. But also on the economic side, we have to make sure that everyone has an equal opportunity to have a job skill. And that's why we need to bring our technical colleges and our high schools together. Every single senior student before they graduate should be able to earn a certificate, apprenticeship, or a degree in some sort of job skill or trade. I mean, we've got shortages in plumbers and electricians and welders and contractors and nurses and IT. That's what manufacturers are saying. We have to make sure, and this would be at no cost, that when a senior leaves high school, they have an opportunity to learn a job skill. That would create jobs for them, they would stay local, and it would help meet a real need that manufacturers have, but also create that equal opportunity for all.
Okay, thank you. You're first on this next question, followed by Brian. And this has to do with housing. Low-income families face a lot of barriers, especially in affordable housing. What do you think are the best strategies to assist low-income families and why? And again, Paul, you'll go first, followed by Brian.
One of the most important things we could do right now is pass our bonding bill that we basically had done in July, but couldn't quite get everyone. That has hundreds of millions of dollars for housing. That would go a huge way in help solving that. Another big issue on top of affordable housing in rural Minnesota is workforce housing. We've got a lot of companies in lease cities that the jobs are available, but the affordable housing or the housing at all for these workers are not. The state has to step in and provide funding, not only for affordable housing, but also for workforce housing. And there's been some efforts and pilot programs to do that. But if we're going to really get a robust rural Minnesota, not only do we have to address the affordable housing issue, we really have to address the workforce housing, because people want to come out here, but if you can't find a place for your family, it's going to be tough to locate. We've got to deal with that issue.
Thank you, Paul. Next, we'll hear from Brian, followed by Edwin. Brian?
I think one of the biggest issues is the cost of what it takes to build a house. If you look at how much it takes to build an affordable house with all the regulations and with all the costs of lumber and materials, everything out there, it's very hard to build a house nowadays that somebody can afford. So I think that we have to look into some ways to maybe reduce some regulations on what it takes to build some of these more affordable homes, and then try to find some ways to reduce the costs on the materials it takes to build these houses. Maybe some different innovative ways to build the homes so that we can reduce the amount of materials it takes to build them. I have some friends of mine that's the industry that they're in. They build affordable housings around the Detroit Lakes communities and in these counties around here. And one of the biggest challenges they face is being able to build those homes. The costs of them every year, the affordable home goes from being $130,000 to $150,000 to $160,000, and it's just not affordable anymore. So I understand where they're coming from.
Thank you. Edwin, we'll hear from you next, followed by Heather.
Well, this touches on the work I did in District 1 as a city councilman and leader of the Thief River Falls Housing Task Force. So we solved a major housing crisis in that community and in that district, leveraging the Minnesota Housing Finance Association, the Minnesota Housing Partnership, and the Greater Minnesota Housing Fund. So these are state agencies along with nonprofits that District 4 is not leveraging right now. So I'd be happy to apply my experience in cultivating workforce housing from District 1 into District 4. I will also add, though, that we need to incentivize renters and bake in some ownership from a renter. So I'm proposing a tax credit that a renter, if they do sweat equity and development of the home with the landlord, working with the landlord, they both would receive a tax credit.
Okay. Thank you, Edwin. Next, we'll hear from Heather, followed by Kent. Heather?
Affordable housing starts with what we can afford. And when we look at the income and the average income within our community, the average rent here is $839 a month, and our average income is roughly $11.50 an hour. And so when you do the math of that, the affordability is really difficult. So I think this is where part of it is implementing the $15 minimum wage so that we can afford to live in houses. But also we need to think outside the box, and it's not always the state's responsibility to help create these housing systems. We have a lot of opportunities within our community with collaboration. I think a tiered system, because it's one thing to give somebody a house. It's another thing to help them gain the skills on how to maintain their house and have ownership for life, and maybe even something that they can pass down to their kids. And so making sure that we partner with job placement services, with our daycare services, and also with our credit unions to help people build those banking relationships so that we can teach people the skills and start small, maybe something as little as doing tiny home communities, because a big house isn't always necessarily the best home for everybody.
Thank you, Heather. Kent?
Yeah, and I would agree with much of what's been said in regard to, well, first of all, we need to pass the bonding bill, as Paul said. The grants that are made available there and are critically important to helping people access affordable housing. Also, subsidies for the companies that are building these homes, because they are very expensive and the materials are very expensive. And also on the regulatory side, that can be a way that we can address the high costs. And I do think there's much we can do there. One of the things that Representative Lean and I worked on, and Representative Marquardt also, was in removing the sprinkler requirement on twin homes that were especially detrimental to the border communities where we saw those twin homes simply being built on the other side of the river. And those are good starter homes for a lot of people. They are affordable. So we want to make sure that we keep those types of homes affordable. We keep people on our side of the river. So all of those things, there's a program that was known as Homework Starts at Home, making sure that we provide funding to help those with children, especially critically important that they have a home and a stable life.
Thank you, Kent. Edwin, you'll be first on this next question, followed by Heather. Excuse me. How will you work to bring the two parties together on your priorities? How will you work to bring the two parties together on your priorities if you're elected? Edwin?
What it comes down to is relationship and treating each other with respect and through respectful dialogue. And so we each have been given unique gifts and talents, everyone in this call, as well as the 200 or so state representatives in the legislature, and to be able to respect them from where they're coming from and who they are. And again, getting away from party politics, party agendas, and doing what's best for our communities. I think we can find some common ground. I truly believe in that. We are all Minnesotans. We all want to have safe communities. We all want to prosper. We all want our children to have a better future than what we've had here. So I definitely believe that we'll be able to work together through respectful dialogue, moving away from party politics and having conversations where everyone's voice is heard and respected.
Thank you, Edwin. Next, we'll hear from Heather, and Brian, you will follow Heather. Go ahead.
That's finding the common ground in situations. I think sometimes we all have the same end goal. We just have different paths of getting there. And so there's just different barriers that tend to get in the way because there's a stigma, that we have to be against each other all the time. And so just making sure that we stay focused on the end goal and the commonalities that we have, making sure that collaboration is a piece of all conversations, and understanding that sometimes we're just not going to agree on things. I think that that's one of the spaces that's really important in everything. I think within our own homes, we don't always agree on everything, but we can still respect each other and move forward. I think that is something that we have seen in the past work really well, and then we see when it doesn't work well at all. And so it's just something that we have to all invest in. And it's, it's personalities working together too. It's not just parties, and making sure that we all come together at the end of the day.
Thank you. Brian?
I think this goes along with
I'm sorry, Brian, go ahead.
quite all right. I think this goes along with just being a decent person. Just in your daily life, you have to deal with people that you may agree with or disagree with, and being able to, come to a common agreement on it is something you have to do anyway. In the end, it's the community and the district that comes first. They're the people that this really matters to. If I have a difference in opinion with somebody, I still have to come up with an answer to solve the community's problem. I don't see any reason why you can't get along with somebody just because they have some different beliefs. You could put 10 Republicans or 10 Democrats in the same room, and all of them are probably going to have different beliefs on any topic. So, to be able to get along with somebody just because you have a few differences, that's just normal life to me.
Okay, thank you. Paul Marquardt. Paul, you're still
Sorry. Okay,
Go ahead.
I'm muted here. So, well, that's been something I have focused on in all my years in the legislature, is that I don't care whose idea it is. If it's going to help District 4B in rural Minnesota, I'm for it. It's not about politics for me. It's about results, doing what I can best for residents back home. And that's not just me saying that. The Pioneer Press did independent research and looked at the votes of all the legislators in the House of Representatives, and out of 134 members, said I was one of the top 3 most bipartisan members in the House. And it's interesting, I had a tax bill up last year, and in that tax bill, I had 41 Republican provisions in that tax bill. That's almost unheard of a chair of the opposite party to do that. But I didn't care about whose idea. We need to do what's best. We need to come together. We need to be bipartisan, because the bottom line is trying to improve the quality of life of folks back home.
Thank you, Paul. Kent?
And I would say that we need to get to know each other as people in the legislature. I actually joined a group known as the Civility Caucus in the legislature. It's bipartisan, it's bicameral, so it's Democrats and Republicans from both the House and the Senate who get together for the purpose of trying to figure out ways to turn down the volume on the rhetoric and stop yelling at each other and start listening to each other. That's critically important. And I think once people get to know each other, that's part of the function of it. You start working together better if you know each other on a personal basis. And it's important to note that in the legislature, it really is about relationships and working with other people. And that's critically important. Compromise is a critical component to any well-functioning democracy. And I've made it clear that I'm willing to listen to anyone and to work with anyone in order to accomplish results in the end. I think that we need to do more of that. I think the bitter partisanship has really poisoned the environment, and that's one of the reasons I joined the Civility Caucus.
Thank you, Kent. We're nearing the end of our time together. We have time for one last question. However, the question will be different if you're an incumbent from that being asked of the challengers. Edwin will go first, followed by Brian. The question to the two of you and Heather is this: what specific steps have you taken to prepare for the office being sought? How would you describe your familiarity with the legislative process? Let me repeat it. What specific steps have you taken to prepare for the office being sought? How would you describe your familiarity with the legislative process? Edwin, you're first, followed by Brian.
Well, I would say that my entire life has been a preparatory process for this season and for this day. I've been engaged on the international level, creating policy for the snowmobile industry, the International Snowmobile Manufacturers Association, and working in Brussels at the Parliament with legislators there in the European Union. So there's just so much as a former city councilman. So, the key for me is to cultivate and try to process and listen to what people are actually saying, to be present to what my constituents, what our community is actually saying. And then from that point, be able to put together actionable items that make sense for our community, make sense for Minnesota. And from there, it's all about, for me, preparing how to listen and looking at our community. And that's what we've been focused on, is doing what's best for the people. And that's why I'm serving.
Thank you, Edwin. Next, we'll hear from Brian, who will be followed by Paul. And to let Paul have a second to think about his question, the question he and Kent will be asked is this: what do you see your role being in 2021, should you be reelected, to end the partisan standoff in the legislature? So I'll let you two think about that while we hear from Brian on preparation for the office being sought.
I've spent my whole life from a young age taking an interest in politics. I've listened to a lot of AM talk radios over the years, and that's what really piqued my interest when I was younger. My dad kind of got me involved. When I was living in St. Cloud, we listened to the AM talk radio. The guy's name kind of slips my tongue right now, but that's the kind of stuff we used to listen to, and me and my dad would talk about that kind of stuff all the time. I started to take more of an interest when I got older, listening to city politics and taking more of an active role in attending meetings and seeing how things get changed in your community. And it really got me interested in taking it to the next step, and actually being part of that change and helping our communities change and get things better for the future and get things done that normally may have not gotten done in our communities. And so I think I really be good at helping our communities do a little better at some of this stuff.
Thank you, Brian. Next, we'll turn to the incumbents.
Terry,
Heather, you get to come last.
Oh, I get to, okay.
You get to come last. There is a scientific method to my madness here. I have a whole chart that tells me to say that. The question to Paul is, what do you see your role being in 2021, should you be reelected, to end the partisan standoff in the legislature? Paul, and then Kent will follow you.
You know, one thing I have learned over the years is that these elections aren't about the candidates, they're about the people you represent. And I've always been a good listener. And that's what I take down to St. Paul. And I think that helps break the partisan gridlock, because in rural Minnesota, in our district, it's a moderate district. There's Democrats, there's Republicans, there's independents, and there's a mixture of views. And I have always been a strong listener and always looking at how can we reach common ground and do what's best for the folks back in the district. And I think that helps bring people together, because you're not out there with a partisan agenda, you're with an agenda for the people that you represent. And so I think with that attitude, everything you do helps bring parties together. But you know, next year we're going to have to look at the COVID-19. Hopefully we have a bonding bill already passed, but we have to look how we can navigate through all that in a bipartisan manner.
Thank you, Paul Marquardt. Kent Egan, your
And
thoughts.
thank you. I already mentioned the Civility Caucus, which I'm going to continue participating in and being a member of. I think it's critically important for rural members, and especially not to engage in the partisanship, because we are outnumbered as rural legislators. Only about a third of legislators come from the rural part of the state. About 2/3 come from the metro area, which means it's even more important for us to stand together to defend and to speak up for rural communities and our concerns, and to articulate them as effectively as we possibly can. I serve on the Ag and Rural Development Committees, both finance and policy, and I can tell you that on those committees, there is a lot of bipartisan work being done. I think it actually serves as a good model for other committees to follow, and how members from different parties can work together. So I'm going to continue doing that. I think that I also intend to speak to members of my own caucus about the need to find that common ground. And I think it's becoming so problematic now that people seem to think if you're not 110% with me, you're my enemy. The fact is that we need to all work to find.
Thank you, Kent Egan. Finally, Heather, what specific steps have you taken to prepare for the office being sought? How would you describe your familiarity with the legislative process? Go ahead, please.
Thank you. For me, I've been organizing really since high school. Grassroots organizing is something that you listen to your community. You listen and you take action, and you listen and you take action, and through that you create change. So for me, I've been doing that my whole entire life. And so when we talk about the importance of listening to our communities and making decisions together, I've done that. And I've done that on small levels, and then I've done it on bigger city levels, and I look forward to doing it on state levels. We've also talked here about the importance of relationships. And I've really focused on that my whole entire life. Part of organizing and part of the work that I've done has been bringing people together and working on trusting relationships. And so not only have I been doing that in this community for nearly 10 years through the work that I've done, both as my career, but also as my volunteer work and the work that I do on my city commissions. But I've also built relationships with people at the state level. I've worked really close with Ben as we create this transition. I meet with Kent on a semi-regular basis, but then also other candidates from around the state, because we know that we cannot make change alone. That is all about relationships, and I've continued to do that and look forward to doing that in the future.
Thank you very much, Heather. That concludes tonight's forum. I would first like to thank all of the candidates for participating. They are State Senate District 4 candidate Kent Egan, State Representative District 4A candidate Heather Keeler, also State Representative District 4A candidate Edwin Hahn, State Representative District 4B candidate Brian Anderson, and State Representative District 4B candidate Paul Marquardt. Thank you all for your willingness to serve and for answering the questions as submitted by the voters. I would like to take a moment too to thank our timer for tonight, Whitney Oxendahl. I'd like to thank the Red River Valley League of Women Voters for letting me come over from Becker County to speak with all of you. I've learned a great deal. about the issues that Clay County and your districts face. They're not unlike the ones rural Becker County faces. Finally, I'd like to tell the voters Minnesota voting information, whether you need to register to vote, request an absentee ballot, or check to make sure if your absentee ballot has been, is available online. It's super easy, mnvotes.org. I'll repeat it, mnvotes.org. If you haven't already done so, please make sure your registration's up to date. Consider voting absentee, know where your polling place is. I probably don't need to remind anyone watching the video that Election Day is Tuesday, November 3rd, but here's the deal. You can also vote today, tomorrow, any weekday during business hours by visiting your local polling place. You can vote the Saturday before Election Day, which happens to be Halloween, between 10 and 3. And you can vote the Monday night before Election Day, November 2nd, until 5 p.m. But on behalf of county auditors and election officials all around Minnesota, I would strongly encourage voters not to wait till 5 o'clock on that Monday night, November 2nd, because that dedicated crew of people who make our elections work are going to have a very long day on November 3rd. So I would encourage you not to wait till the last minute. And then obviously you can vote at your polling place on November 3rd. The other final thought I'd like to share with all the voters is a simple one. Let's all agree to be patient with the results. We know voter turnout nationally, locally, statewide is going to be very heavy. We are not going to all know the results before 11 p.m. with the late local news or whatever. It is going to take some time. You might also want to remember, voters, that ballots received up to 7 days after Election Day will be counted. And canvassing boards will be meeting November 12th or 13th to certify the votes. That's when the results become official. So please vote, please be patient. With that, I'd like to again thank all the candidates and thank you all for watching and for voting on November 3rd. Have a good day.